Welcome to episode 68. Today we are focusing on occupancy limits. So let's get started. Hello everyone and welcome to the Fair Housing Insiders. I'm your host, Jonathan Sarr, and with me today is Kathy Williams. And we'd like to remind you that we love providing these shows for you. These are complimentary fair housing education. So remember to subscribe to our channel on YouTube, give us those thumbs up, sign up for our newsletter since we're always sending out relevant current information. We want to make sure you have access to that. If you like social media, please follow us on Instagram at Fair Housing Institute, where we also post many other fair housing training related tips and clips. So today we're talking about occupancy limits. So let's get into our scenario and then we'll have Kathy's comments on them. The scenario is a husband and a wife who have 3 children and are looking for a 2-bedroom apartment. So let's take a look.
We are interested in seeing your 2-bedroom apartments.
I've noticed you have a large family. We actually have a lot of big 3-bedroom units available for very reasonable rates. I would be happy to show you those models.
Excuse me?
Well, you see, our units have an occupancy limit of 2 per bedroom. Our 2-bedroom apartments only permit 2 persons per bedroom, so we wouldn't be allowed to offer it to your family. In addition, there's an issue because your 3 children are different genders, and sharing a bedroom would also be a problem with our occupancy policies.
So Kathy, interesting scenario. Is there an occupancy limit law that this housing provider has to follow?
For most housing providers, unfortunately, there's not. And so it's not that simple to say, follow the law. In fact, for most housing providers, they're going to have to go through a process of deciding what a reasonable occupancy policy is. If you remember, we've talked about disparate impact in the past in some of our videos. Well, this is another one of those topics where having an occupancy limit that's too restrictive could have a negative impact on families with children. So that's why we have to be able to defend your occupancy limit if it gets challenged in a fair housing complaint as having a disparate impact and therefore being perhaps discriminatory. So whatever occupancy limit you have, you need to make sure you can defend it, and it needs to be well thought out. In many cases on this topic, and there have been a lot of cases around the country, there was some occupancy codes that could be found in the local applicable building codes for that property. And usually courts certainly look at that to decide how many people can safely live in, for instance, a certain square foot apartment. So that's one place to look when you're trying to come up with a defensible occupancy policy.
Are there any other resources that are available?
There are. One resource that a lot of housing providers use is what we often refer to as the Keating memo that came out of HUD that appeared to say 2 persons per bedroom was acceptable. And that is indeed the industry standard, 2 persons per bedroom. If you have federally funded housing, that's the standard you should be using because that's the standard that's in the applicable handbooks. If you are private market housing or even tax credit housing, however, then you're going to have to defend your own standard. And you need to look at perhaps some additional things that some of which came out of the Keating memo, such as how many sleeping areas, even if they're not designated as a bedroom, that you have. And you also have to look at, by the way, state and local law. Let me give you an example of that. In Indiana, the Indiana has a statute that gives housing providers how to determine what a reasonable occupancy standard are. In California, the enforcement agency for fair housing cases has said if housing providers don't have a 2+1 standard, they're going to investigate it as potentially discriminatory. And we'll talk about what that standard is more in just a minute.
Okay, that's interesting. So, if there is no local law, how does a property decide what their occupancy limit should be, and keeping fair housing in mind?
So I think there's a variety of considerations, and I've mentioned several of those. And I think how you have to go about deciding, if you remember this scenario, we had a 5-person family and they wanted to rent a 2-bedroom apartment. And the leasing agent said, no, that would be a violation of our occupancy limit. So in that case, in some areas, it might be safer for that property to adopt what we call a 2+1 standard. And in California, I think absolutely that would be a good idea. And a 2+1 standard is 2 persons per bedroom plus 1 additional person. So that expands the typical 2 per bedroom standard that's often used. And so in a 1-bedroom, you could have 3 people. In a 2-bedroom, you could have 5 people with a 2+1. Another way of expanding the typical 2-person per bedroom would be to not count infants in the total count of people, because oftentimes an infant can sleep in the same bedroom with their parents, for instance. So if you didn't count infants, a lot of times that will expand your limit, and you can decide what an infant is. Some companies use a 1-year infancy definition, and some people use a 2-year infancy definition. So there are a variety of ways of looking at, do you just want to stick with the 2-bedroom standard, or should you be expanding it? And for most private market housing providers, I think they should look at ways of expanding it if they can.
So, should the occupancy limit include specifics such as age or gender?
The short answer is no, it shouldn't. It should be always up to the family to decide who sleeps where in an apartment. So if a family wants children to share a bedroom and bunk beds or whatever, that's up to them. That is not up to the landlord. The only time I'd say consider the age is when I mentioned earlier about an infant and not counting infants. So in that way, you would decide the age of what qualifies it, but as an infant. Other than that, you should be looking at the number of people and the size of the apartment. Let me clarify too, that when I talk about this, I am talking about when you're limiting the number of people in a family that can live in an apartment. There are all kinds of reasons to expand that number by age and gender. If you're talking about some type of either subsidized apartment or low income tax credit, where a family might want to have a 3-bedroom because their children are of different ages or different genders. In that case, the family has the right to ask for that rather than a landlord who's trying to force a family into a larger unit. That's different than the family asking to live in a larger unit. So don't get those two issues confused when I talk about those limitations. This is a difficult subject to talk about briefly. So, Jonathan, I hope in this brief time we've covered enough information so people can get an idea if their occupancy policy is something that maybe they should go back and take another look at.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Kathy, so much. It's been a very intriguing discussion. And yeah, there's a lot more to it. As a matter of fact, there's going to be a part 2 to this particular subject when it comes to occupancy limits. Our next episode in this series will be talking about how to enforce occupancy limits. So to our audience, make sure you tune in for part 2 of this topic. Very, very important. So thank you again, Kathy. We look forward to having you again on the show very soon. So thank you everyone too for tuning in today. We're grateful to you. Please remember, we love those thumbs. Give us those thumbs up on this YouTube episode. We appreciate your support. By your support and your thumbs up, it helps others become aware of this show, and we're grateful for our amazing audience. We also love your feedback, any comments or questions, topics you'd like to see discussed. Feel free to message us. We look forward to hearing from you. Until next time, take care, everyone.